Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. What if you are the listing broker and you have used Form 7F to create a variable compensation offer from your seller to a buyer broker? Here's what I mean, and I don't care if you've used 7F or some other form. You could use any form to create this outcome. But the seller's offer of compensation requires certain action from the buyer broker. If the buyer broker does this, the seller's offer of compensation is X. If the buyer broker does this, the seller's offer of compensation is Y, etc. Question is, when buyer broker submits their offer, if they put into paragraph 17A what will auto-populate from Northwest MLS, or whatever number they believe to be correct if it's an NAR MLS, and let's say they just put in X with no mention of Y as the seller's offer of compensation, is that accurate? And the answer is no, that's not accurate. That's not what the seller has offered as compensation. But more importantly, in paragraph 17B, they have also put X as the buyer broker compensation. Now, let's assume that certain actions are required from that buyer broker before they will actually earn X compensation based on the seller's offer. Based on the intention of the seller in offering compensation to buyer broker, seller expected that buyer would perform certain tasks along the way. And if buyer broker did not perform all of those tasks, then seller's offer of compensation to buyer broker would have been Y. But if buyer broker writes X into 17B and seller signs the agreement, buyer and seller reach mutual acceptance on the purchase and sale agreement, and 17B says X as the amount of compensation, the question is, if buyer broker then fails to perform some task that seller had intended for buyer broker to perform, does buyer broker still get X? And the answer to that question is yeah, because seller is now contractually obligated based on the completion of paragraph 17B to pay buyer broker X. Whatever amount is identified in paragraph 17B is the compensation that seller is contractually obligated to pay buyer broker. If seller intends to reserve the right to reduce the amount of compensation that seller is obligated to pay buyer broker based on the buyer broker's performance throughout the processing of the transaction from the time of mutual acceptance to closing, then listing broker, you're going to have to make sure that that conditional language is incorporated in the purchase and sale agreement, paragraph 17B. And the reason why I said it's more important in paragraph 17B than 17A is because 17A is supported by boilerplate language in paragraph U, which says if the buyer broker is incorrect in their description of the seller's offer of compensation, then seller's offer of compensation is actually what it was published as, regardless of what the buyer broker writes. So 17A is self-correcting. 17B has no similar language. The boilerplate language in paragraph U says with respect to 17B simply that seller shall pay the identified amount of compensation to buyer broker. So listing broker, if you receive an offer from a buyer trying to accept seller's offer of compensation and seller's offer of compensation requires additional conduct from buyer along the way, then when you come to paragraph 17B, you are going to have to counter buyer's offer where they have written X in 17B. You're going to have to counter buyer's offer to change paragraph 17B to reflect the conditional offer of compensation from the seller. That seller agrees to pay buyer broker X if buyer does the following, but seller shall pay buyer Y if buyer broker does does not do all of the following, or however it would be written to make sense, to be consistent with what seller's offer was. In other words, whatever the variable rate of compensation is that seller offers, if that's what seller intends to be bound by in the purchase and sale agreement, then you are going to have to incorporate all of that conditional compensation language into paragraph 17B. There's certainly not room to write it in that blank on 17B, so you are going to have to counter whatever buyer puts in there and then write it on a counter offer form, or in some way incorporate it into the purchase and sale agreement. I would suggest a counteroffer form would probably be the best way. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please visit warealtor.org and ask me a question. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.